Okay. So it's 5 o'clock, which is when this Zoom webinar is supposed to start. So I think we should just start. We're fortunate to have our guests with us. So I'll begin with the introductions now. Good afternoon, everybody. My name's Dan Fagan. I'm a professor of science journalism at the Carter Institute of Journalism at New York University, where my job is to run the Science, Health, and Environmental Reporting program and the Science Communication workshops. So we're obviously very interested in science communication here at NYU. With the essential support of the Kavli Foundation, we sponsor events that bring scientists and journalists together to talk about current challenges and opportunities. This afternoon's discussion is part of that series called the Kavli Conversations. It will be recorded and posted at journalism.nyu.edu/KC, where you can also watch dozens of other conversations. Our moderator for this series is my friend and colleague, Robert Lee Holtz, who is a science writer at the Wall Street Journal, as well as a distinguished writer in residence at the Carter Institute. Lee will be joining me today in co-moderating this event. Thanks, Lee. And we are also very, very grateful to our two guests, who I'll introduce in a minute, Katharine Hayhoe and Ron Klain. They're both very busy people right now, and we're grateful to them both for participating. So we're all communicating differently these days, and this event will be no exception. Since we're using the webinar form of Zoom, you're probably seeing both a chat box and a question box on your screen, but we're not actually using the chat box, which is disabled. So don't bother using the chat because no one will see what you're chatting. On the other hand, please do use the question box to ask any questions you have as the conversation proceeds. Lee and I will pick out your questions and ask them as we go. As audience members, you will only see your own questions, but we moderators, we have all-seeing power. We will see all of your questions and we'll look for opportunities to introduce them into the discussion. Okay, enough logistics. The reason you're here is that we have two fantastic speakers today. You already know who they are, so I'll keep the introductions brief. In alphabetical order, Katharine Hayhoe is one of the highest profile climate scientists in the world for very good reasons. She is renowned not only for her research, but also for her communication insights. Dr. Hayhoe started out studying astronomy, but did her grad studies in atmospheric science. She's now the co-director of the Climate Center at Texas Tech University, where she focuses on both projections and current impacts of climate change. In addition to teaching atmospheric science, she also lectures about public policy and public health at Texas Tech. And by the way, Katharine's TED Talk has more than 3 million views, and it's not as dumb as most TED Talks. It's quite good. You should check it out. We also want to welcome Ron Klain. Most of you no doubt feel you already know Ron from his many television news appearances, especially recently. Mr. Klain is a lawyer whose many years of public service include 2 years as chief of staff to then Vice President Joe Biden from 2009 to 2011, and 2 more years in the White House as President Obama's Ebola response coordinator from 2014 to 2015. Ron's long career also includes stints screening judges for President Clinton, serving as chief of staff to Vice President Gore, and fighting over all those miserable hanging chads in the contested year 2000 presidential election, which now seems so very long ago, doesn't it? Ron is currently general counsel to an investment firm, as well as a prominent surrogate for Joe Biden in the current presidential campaign. Okay, now on to the discussion, which I would like to frame with a quick but important caveat. We're calling this after COVID, but that's a misnomer because we, of course, are still somewhere in the middle of what is, for much of the world, arguably, probably the biggest collective crisis we've faced in 75 years, at least. By focusing this afternoon's discussion on the future and not on the urgency of right now, we run the risk of somehow minimizing the current crisis. We definitely don't want to do that. Many millions of lives are at stake right now. Decisions that are being made right now will play a big role in determining who will die and how the rest of us will live. This is heavy stuff, important stuff right now, obviously. For the purposes of this event, though, we're making the calculation that you're already aware of the current emergency. After all, you're living it, especially here in New York. You're also watching people like Ron on TV every day discussing urgent concerns about testing and contact tracing and reopening the economy, whatever that means exactly. So for the next 90 minutes, at least, we want to expand the discussion by jumping ahead to the post-pandemic world and by thinking about what we can and should be doing as journalists, public health practitioners, scientists, students, and citizens to anticipate, understand, and perhaps even help shape what comes next, including how to address the slower moving, but even more difficult crisis of global climate change. Mm-hmm. And with that, I will at last turn things over to Lee for the first question. Take it away, Lee.
Thank you, Dan. Well, as Ron's one-time White House colleague frequently reminds us all, we should never let a good crisis go to waste. So in that spirit, we have an almost unprecedented opportunity for fundamental change here. Change for the better or change for the worse. I mean, we certainly have the crisis, indeed more than one. We struggle to control an infectious virus while we wrestle with our own role in disruptive climate change. So what I would like to ask the two of you, and Katharine, I'll ask you to go first. What do you consider the 2 or 3 most important lessons that we should be learning from this horrific experience with these two things? One, the very fast and inexorable spread of this virus, and 2, the slower but no less unavoidable challenge of climate change. How might they brace us to confront the other challenges that we will face in the future?
I think there are a number of parallels. And the first parallel I can think of is the Ben Franklin axiom, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. We've known in disaster mitigation for a long time that every dollar you invest today saves, depending on the circumstances, anywhere from 6 to 8 to 10 or more dollars in the future. And we are seeing the value of preparation as well as the cost of lack of preparation today. I think what we're also seeing, though, is what's important to us. For so long, we have been increasingly fractured and divided along ideological and tribal lines. But what the pandemic is showing us is what climate change shows us too, and that is no matter who we are, no matter where we're from, no matter what language we speak, no matter what side of the political spectrum we're from, when it all comes down to it, what matters to us is the same, and that is the health and the safety of our family, our friends, our loved ones, our communities, and more. And then the third thing that we're realizing, and we've seen this before, but we are seeing it today in spades, is that when something affects us, it affects the economy. We cannot have a healthy economy without a healthy society, and we cannot have a healthy society without a healthy planet. The economy cannot somehow float around in outer space without the resources that this planet provides. And so caring about the planet is not about saving the Earth. The Earth is still going to orbit the sun long after we're gone. It is about saving us.
So, Ron, how would you answer that question?
Well, so I agree with largely what Katharine said. I just want to add a few finer points on it. First of all, this is a little bit of a reminder that the issues of climate change and infectious disease are also inextricably intertwined. While this particular virus may not be the product of climate change, we know that lots of other viruses are, because they destroy habitat. Climate change destroys habitat, and as a result, humans and animals get into closer proximity. You have zoonotic disease spread from animals to humans, and then on from humans to other humans. You also have climate change changing the habitat of various vectors, particularly mosquitoes, that spread other kinds of diseases, not this disease, but other kinds of diseases that are infectious diseases. So first of all, we're talking about these two things as if they're in parallel, but in fact, they're actually quite interconnected on a going forward basis. So I just want to put that
out there. The epidemic and the climate issue, you're saying these two are sides of the same coin?
Yes, I mean, there's no question that one reason why we're seeing an acceleration in emerging and new infectious diseases is because of climate change, because of the further reach of species that spread these diseases to humans, because of the interaction between humans and species, the competition for habitat. Again, not this virus, but other viruses, things like Zika, things like malaria, things like dengue fever, other diseases, even Ebola, which I helped lead the fight on in 2014 from the White House's perspective, was a disease where arguably you could say that what happened was as humans living in Guinea were forced into competition with animal species and habitat destruction you were seeing, it definitely creates this spread of diseases from animals to humans. So that's the first thing I just want to throw out there. We can come back to that later. I think two points to kind of build on what Katharine said is, I think, first of all, we're seeing play out a dynamic in this epidemic response that is definitely reminiscent of the polarized debate about climate change that Katharine alluded to, which is this debate about the role of science in policymaking and this kind of populist fever against expert-led opinion. When we see these people protesting against wearing masks, protesting against government shutdown, shuts down parts of the economy, protesting against these government policies, it's a lot of the same kind of things we see in the breaking out around climate change. I saw people today, protesters carrying signs that said, "Science is fake news." And that dynamic is a dynamic that is definitely impeding this response as well as our response to climate change. The last thing I want to say on this point is, I host a podcast about the epidemic. It's called Epidemic with Dr. Celine Gounder. He's a doctor in New York City who's right now at work in major hospital in New York treating COVID patients. And one of our favorite sayings on that podcast is that this epidemic affects everyone, but it doesn't affect everyone equally. And I think we see a lot of the same things around environmental issues as well. Climate change obviously is a global challenge. It affects all of us, but it doesn't affect everyone the same way. And here with COVID-19, what we're seeing is communities of color are much harder hit, poorer communities are much harder hit, and we need to be aware of that as we think about the possible responses. And of course, that's true for environmental issues as well.
Yes, I think you're making a very interesting point that's worth exploring. And we do want to talk more as we get further into this conversation about some of these other matters, but how this current pandemic has highlighted various structural things about our economy and our cultures. I think something that I'd like to put in front of you right now. I mean, it's certainly the case that these last few weeks, depending on where you are, for me, it's been 65 days. I've counted every one of them, sheltering at home, working at home. They've been stressful, but in a weird way, they've also been remarkably clarifying. I mean, I live in New York, I'm in Manhattan. The air of this city has never been cleaner, I think, in anyone's lifetime. Wildlife are wasting no time venturing back into the spaces that we have abandoned, I hope temporarily. Amid all the horrible economic dislocation and devastation, we are perhaps, the optimists among us may think, learning new ways of working, new ways of playing. And maybe there's a fresh appreciation for the role of government in protecting and improving human life. I'm wondering, Ron, you of course alluded to the demonstrations, but if we sort of may pick up just the thread of the role of government in our lives as an active and proactive force. I mean, do you think that's something that's going to last past the last antibody test sometime in the later part of this coming decade? What will fall by the wayside? So,
yeah. No, look, I hope that I think people are seeing, I want to try to say this in a way that doesn't sound partisan, but I think people are seeing kind of both the best and the worst of their government at work. I think on a nonpartisan basis, let me say, we're seeing governors all over the country, Democrats and Republicans, conservatives and liberals, all stripes, really following, by and large, a lot of them, scientific advice, doing right by their states, trying to be mindful about how they balance these economic concerns, these public health concerns, trying to make the right decision. I just have to be honest and say they're seeing something very different in Washington, D.C. What they're seeing in Washington is a federal government that's largely abandoned them. It's largely left the fighting of this disease to state governments to sort out, left the key decisions to state governments to sort out. And I think the lasting legacy of this may be an appreciation for the fact that we're a big country, and letting each state do it on its own is not really a viable solution for a challenge of this scope and magnitude. A challenge that is truly international in nature, a challenge that initiated overseas, but now is spread throughout our country. And the idea that somehow we should kind of roll the clock back to an era before our country existed as a single united country and have individual states and little groups of states and little coalitions trying to fight this thing in little pockets. I hope that's a lesson we learn as a failed approach here, that that instead having a stronger, more vigorous, more active federal government would have done much better in trying to bring this under control.
If I may, just before going to Katharine for that, I'd like to, you said the word international, and I think it's hard in the current time right now to sort of separate out our feelings about government broadly as a force and as a mechanism from, as you suggested, partisan issues. So I'd like you to just take a broader look internationally, because we see a variety of different ways of dealing with this, but they all have this thread that they seem to be, for the moment, reinforcing the beneficial role of government, regardless of the ideology of the person running it, the people running it. So what I'm wondering is, do you think this is something that will take hold and maintain past the current crisis, the value of collective action?
Yeah, I think so in some ways. I mean, I think what's important is the best responses are coming from governments around the world that put science first and use expert-based approaches to attack this disease. Those approaches differ a little bit from country to country, but by and large, they involve basically the same things: testing widely, tracing those people who have cases, protecting healthcare workers, all these things. And what we're seeing is that approach is working in the countries that are using it aggressively, and somewhat without regard to the ideology of the particular government in that way, right? There is, though, a subset of ideologies that we have to call out, and those are kind of more authoritarian regimes, more populist kind of regimes, where they are practicing denial of the disease, where they are saying, this really isn't a problem, it's just the flu, don't worry about it, we have it under control, we don't need to listen to these experts. And then we're seeing really negative approaches there. So I think, and the other thing I want to say about international is, we here in this country right now are understandably focused on fighting this disease in the United States. That is job number one for us. I understand that. But this disease is going to spread increasingly in Africa and in South America. Largely so far, this has been a phenomenon of the global north, where our approach has been to allow each country to kind of fight it on its own with its own national healthcare system. But as it spreads in Africa and in South America, there's going to be a call for a kind of development response, a global response. And the question will be, what role the United States will play in helping to fight this disease overseas. And what we've seen time and again is that in the end, and this is connected to a lot of the issues Katharine talks about, in the end, we are only as safe and secure here as the whole planet is safe and secure. We extinct
Katharine, I'm sorry.
Rages in Africa, then eventually it's going to come back here too. That's the reality.
Katharine, I want to pick up this thread with you. Certainly you have the battle scars of the efforts to sort of get global collective action in the area of climate regulation and climate, what I'd like to call climate normalization, really. But when you look at the remarkable international response to this epidemic, I mean, do you think this is a lesson that was going to sink in and will shape future efforts and future responses to other issues?
Mm-hmm. I certainly hope that it will. But here is one of the biggest differences between climate change and the coronavirus pandemic. As Ron and I have been talking about, there's many similarities. They threaten the same things that we value. They disproportionately affect the poorest and most vulnerable, those who are already in need and suffering. They are global issues that require cooperation and strong government. But the difference is timescale. Now, one of the questions I saw said, why do you talk about climate change as a slow-moving issue? It depends on your perspective. The coronavirus pandemic overtook us in a matter of days to weeks. Mm-hmm. And in terms of climate change, we are where we were in the pandemic back in the early days of March. Mm-hmm. But to get from the early days of March to mid-March, when all the travel restrictions went into place and then the quarantine a few days later, it's going to take us a number of years to get there with climate change. And the problem is this: by the time we start to see increasingly worse impacts of climate change, it's too late to act to prevent those. We have to prevent the impacts before we see them. And so my concern as a climate scientist is that if we wait until the devastating and unmistakable impacts of climate change are staring every single person in the country in the eyeballs directly, at that point, it will be too late to avoid many of the most serious and dangerous impacts. So that psychological distance, which was an issue with the pandemic, the psychological distance of, oh, it's happening over there and not here, or it's happening in the future, but not now. That psychological distance was about this wide for the pandemic, but for climate change, it's much larger. And so that's why the work that I do, working with cities and organizations, businesses, nonprofits, and the National Climate Assessment in particular, that work is designed to decrease the psychological distance, to show people that no matter where you live today, you are already being affected by climate change, making hurricanes more damaging, burning greater area by wildfire, making heat waves more intense, increasing the risk of flooding. That is already happening today, and the time to act is now.
So I wanted to follow up on this question of warnings. You know, people like Katharine and her predecessors have been talking about climate change for decades, literally. And the longer we wait, the harder it gets. And I think, you know, there's a deeper problem at work that I wanted to ask you both about. You know, on the line now, we've got a few hundred early career journalists, scientists, physicians. So we're not exactly a demographic cross-section of America. And I don't want to stereotype the audience, but I'm guessing, I think it's a good guess, that most of the people you're speaking to today, Ron and Katharine, were feeling frustrated and disappointed about public life, about our ability to act collectively in response to the evidence. We're feeling that way long before COVID-19 and even before Donald Trump strutted onto the scene. So if I could summarize what might be the root of the frustration in a single sentence, I would say that many of our fellow citizens simply don't trust us. They don't trust journalists, they don't trust scientists, they don't trust government officials, they don't trust CEOs. They're skeptical of both our motives and our knowledge. And it's not only personal. Our work products, which can be boiled down to various attempts at evidence-based problem solving, they're rejected by our fellow citizens as biased or pompous, self-interested. Do you agree with this diagnosis? And does it really all come down to trust? And if so, what can we possibly do about that? Let's start with Katharine and then Ron.
I definitely want to hear Ron's take on this for sure. I would say that we have absolutely committed a mistake, and I would say this as scientists and as science journalists. And our mistake has been that we think that facts will change people's minds. If we just present the truth will be blindingly obvious to everyone. If they don't agree with us, we just have to present more scientific evidence, and then surely they'll agree. And what we have learned is that that is not the way the human brain works. Today, the number one predictor on issues that are politically polarized is not how much education we have, how smart we are, how much science we know, how scientifically literate we are. The number one predictor on politically polarized science issues of what we think is simply what elite cues tell us. Elite cues are people who we trust, whose values we share. Now, for example, on black holes, you know, if somebody didn't have the right opinion on black holes and you told them the right information, they would probably say, okay, sure. They might not remember it, but they would accept it. But that's not politically polarized. Whereas climate change and environmental issues, which are not quite the same thing, because climate change affects us very personally too. Those are the two most polarized issues in the country. And so the number one predictor of whether we agree with science that dates back to the 1850s is simply where we fall on the political spectrum. So we're going to believe someone who shares of all of our values over believing the preponderance of evidence from thousands of scientists, from tens of thousands of peer-reviewed publications, and from the best science journalists in the world because they work for the mainstream media. So that is the challenge that we have, and not understanding that challenge, I think, was our original mistake.
What do we do about it is really what I'm trying to get at. That's
Oh.
the really hard part of that. And of course, Catherine, I don't expect you to, even someone who's thought about this as intelligently as you have for so long, I know there's no single glib answer. But you know, if you had to point to a few things that we can and should be doing, what would you say?
Absolutely. So first of all, that's my TED Talk.
Watch that TED Talk.
And the important thing, I think, is to start with shared values. And so studies have shown that when we decrease the psychological distance of the issue, when we bring the impacts home to where we live, things we care about, our local economy, jobs, the military, our families, our health, our recreational activities, when we bring the issue home, it decreases the political partisanship. Because we're starting with a value that we share rather than a value that divides us. So really figuring out how we can make that human connection first, and it could be over something as trivial as knitting or food or the fact that we enjoy, I just did a webcast with Burton Snowboards the other day, the fact that we enjoy a recreational activity, or we might be both a member of the Rotary Club or of the same faith, which is a lot of the connections that I make, making that personal connection first. And in journalism, you are so good at doing that, by telling those personal stories that bring people in. And then once we identify with each other, then connect the dots to why this issue affects who we already are and what we already care about. Because people feel like I have to change who I am. I have to become a tree-hugging, bleeding heart liberal in order to care about climate change. And the reality is the only thing we have to be to care about climate change is a human living on planet Earth. And as far as I know, we are all that, but we just haven't connected the dots. So rather than trying to say you have to be this type of person to care, it's more a case of saying you already care, you just haven't realized it. Let's connect the dots, showing how who you already are is the perfect person to care. And in fact, here's the extra on top of it. By caring about and by supporting climate action, you are actually a more genuine expression of who you are. We haven't gone there yet.
Yeah. Wow, that's really, really well put, and very consistent, as Catherine knows, with what the best social science literature tells us about how to actually convince someone, you know, how to actually get in a true dialogue with someone. So we have a lot of great questions, and I want to ask one of those in a minute, but first, Ron, do you have a take on this question of trust and restoring trust?
Yeah, look, I do. Obviously, I agree with much of what Catherine said, but I'd like to go at it from a slightly different way. It isn't just about the communications. It's often about the communicator. And so we found this in fighting Ebola in West Africa. One of the facts about Ebola that's most interesting is that it's maximally infectious at the time of death. That when you die, your body sheds the virus, and most of the disease that was spreading in West Africa was coming from people as they died. And in West Africa, there was a burial practice, a cultural burial practice, different from some of them in the West, but kind of resonant with them, that relatives collectively got together to wash the bodies of the dead. And that's how this disease was spreading wildly in West Africa, because people, as they die, are maximally infectious. People were washing those bodies. The disease was spreading like wildfire that way. And so the question is, how did you try to persuade people to stop doing this thing that was spreading the disease? Well, it was such a culturally ingrained practice. And of course, phase one was to send in a bunch of doctors and scientists to say, don't you know, this is how the disease is spreading. Don't you know, this is how you're getting sick. You're washing these bodies, so on and so forth. And that phase was spectacularly unsuccessful, okay? And in the end, what we hit upon was working directly with faith leaders in West Africa. These were largely Muslim countries. We worked directly with imams, some of whom were very anti-American. They weren't really our natural allies in this effort. These were not the kinds of people with whom we had a lot of common ground. But these imams wanted to see their adherents not die. And so they gradually worked through their communities and persuaded people that there were other burial practices that were equally acceptable in their traditions, equally acceptable in their faiths. There were ways to do this that were safe. And so it was a powerful lesson that sometimes it is the communication, but sometimes it is the communicator. And finding these trusted communicators, even if you don't think of imams, these aren't public health experts. They don't have the science. They don't have the facts in the way that Catherine was alluding to earlier. but they have the trust. And on something that's so important, they were the right communicators. And I think this is a challenge for the public health community going forward. We're going to, a year from now, hopefully, maybe less, have a vaccine. And we're going to have to persuade people to take that vaccine. In the face of strong anti-vaccine sentiment in this country, in other developed countries around the world, in the face of all kinds of resistance, and how public health leaders are persuasive in that conversation will turn in part on messages, but in part on messengers. And we're going to need both to be persuasive in that conversation.
I just jump in, Dan, because this kind of logically follows to something. I got to be blunt, my friends. I think it's great, Katharine, that you want us to do a better job of connecting the dots. And I think it's great, Ron, that you want us to talk to people who are not our natural allies in a better way. But I mean, how much of this is our fault? I mean, you know, people have been connecting the dots on climate change for 40 years, and it doesn't appear to work very well. And Ron, there's something about this epidemic or something about Ebola that you can get that conversation going because, I don't know, there's a person dying in front of you. I mean, I don't understand, but what I do understand is that there may be something that is our fault. That's my question. As the sort of social media chattering class, as mass communicators, I mean, where are we going wrong?
If I could just jump in there for a second, you're absolutely right. So the way that Dan phrased the question was, you know, was there something we could have done differently? But if you actually want to proportion blame, this much blame would be the scientists and the communicators. We officially warned the US president of the dangers of climate change 55 years ago. And obviously when I say we, I was not one of the scientists at that time. That's how long we've been doing it. If you wanted to assign the blame, what does the lion's share of it go to? The 90 corporations who are responsible for 2/3 of greenhouse gas emissions since the dawn of the industrial era, which include most of the richest corporations in the world, which back when this issue really started to rise to the forefront back in the 80s, they made a cold calculation and they decided it is a lot cheaper to fund think tanks to attack scientists, to obscure the data, to run op-eds, than it is to actually become an energy company rather than oil and gas company. And Merchants of Doubt, that fantastic book by Naomi Oreskes and Eric Conway, as well as a great movie too, lays out in excruciating detail how the same techniques that were used in the tobacco industry to obscure the connection between smoking and tobacco and lung cancer, the same approaches were also used to obscure the connections between our choices and the fact that climate is changing.
Right. I want to be argumentative for just a moment, if I may. It's not my natural frame of but Katharine, you're kind of demonstrating my point. There's a rich literature about how people have been hoodwinked and bamboozled and sold a bill of goods, and pick a cliche you like. And yet that communication somehow takes root, takes hold, and is persuasive. And yet what we do, we might as well be talking to the wall. I mean, you're kind of illustrating my question, really. Why does that work and what we do doesn't work?
It's because there's well-trodden paths of thought. So you could spend a ton of money on something, but if you're not taking advantage of a well-trodden path of thought in people's minds, you're not going to get hardly any return. But if you're working with a society that already has a strong thread of anti-intellectualism running through it, that book, Anti-Intellectualism in American Life, was published in 1965, I think, right? Mm-hmm. And so you already have a strong individualistic tendency running through people. You have a strong aversion to government control running through people. You already have traditional fault lines between religion and science running through the culture. So you already have these well-trodden paths that you can very intelligently kind of gather together and take advantage of so that your messages run down these well-trodden paths instead of beating their way through the bushes.
Ron, how should we get off the well-beaten path and get our message across? How does it work from your standpoint?
Well, look, I think I understand what Katharine's saying. I think I agree with a lot of it, but I would say where I slightly disagree is I think it's incumbent on those of us communicating on these issues to try to find ways to get through the kind of obstacles she's talking about. And Lee, the question of whose fault it is, whatever, let's put that aside for a second. Talk about how we can increase our effectiveness in communicating on these issues. And look, I think we're seeing a version of this right now play out in real time with COVID over this debate on masks. It's a great example of this, right? Why is there so much resentment about people having to wear masks? Why are we seeing these rising anti-mask movements? And, you know, part of that is all the kinds of things Katharine's talking about, tensions between elites and intellectuals and whatnot. But part of that may be that the public health community didn't do a great job of explaining effectively to people what the point of masks are. That is, the point of masks really aren't to keep you safe, but to keep other people safe. And so your refusal to wear a mask is not an act of bravery or machismo or, you know, your indestructibility. It's an act of selfishness. It's an act of not doing the right thing by your fellow persons. If you're the kind of person who goes to the airport and applauds for the greatest generation as they fly and land on these flights to Washington, D.C. to see great sights here and so on and so forth, well, then you should wear a mask because you want to protect that greatest generation from getting COVID. And so I think, like, it's incumbent on communicators to think about how to put these things in a way that's maximally effective. Now, there is no question that with regard to environmental issues generally and climate change specifically, there is a well-funded, determined effort to undermine effective communications and to do the things Katharine's talking about. But I think on all these issues, all these science-based issues, it's a struggle, and the good guys, if you will, we have to figure out how to get better at our side of the struggle. And, that's, again, I'm not talking about fault or whatever, but that, that is definitely something we're going to face. And in beating COVID, that is going to be critical because we're going to be back at this vaccine crossroads in a year. And it is going to be a struggle to get people to take many people to get the vaccine. Of course, many people will take it, won't be a struggle at all, but to get to high levels of immunization, which is what's needed to create population-wide immunity, herd immunity, you're going to have to really persuade a lot of people to get over the line.
So on that subject of misinformation, we actually have a very relevant question from, and by the way, everyone should know, if you have questions, use the Q&A box. We're seeing them and we're going to try to work them into the discussion. This is a question from Abe Musselman, who is he's an incoming student of mine in science journalism. And he asks, does the government have a role in combating the misinformation about climate science that comes out of fossil fuel funded think tanks and media outlets? And one could also say misinformation that comes out about the safety of vaccines, that comes out of, dark parts of the web. And the context for that clearly is that we journalists do not have nearly the clout or authority that we used to have. At least I don't think so. Where the ecosystem, the information ecosystem is, you could call it democratized, or you could call it just sort of anarchic, but it's very different. And as a result, beating down misinformation becomes really difficult. And so is it time for the government to be more aggressive about stepping in, and doesn't that raise real dangers if it does? Ron, you could take that first, but I definitely want to hear from Katharine on this too.
Well, I obviously think we're a free country and we have a First Amendment, and I don't want that changed. And I want the government not to regulate speech. I don't want the government to intervene in people's right to speak, obviously peacefully. I mean, maybe not carrying around assault weapons, but peacefully. And I think that's an important thing. I think the government obviously has a key role, though, in getting facts and science out, and certainly not suppressing facts and science. I mean, it's hard to pull this out of the current context, but we have an administration right now that's doing everything it can to kind of suppress scientific information, whether that's preventing members of the coronavirus task force from testifying on Capitol Hill, or taking a Sharpie to NOAA forecasts, or suppressing and removing climate science from government websites. And so I guess the first step would be for our government to stop suppressing science and going backwards in that regard. But look, I also think, to your point, last thing I want to say, Dan, about the kind of democratization of information, it does lead to more chaos and confusion leads to new opportunities. I'm very proud. My wife 2 years ago started a environmental reporting daily newsletter called Our Daily Planet. That's gained tens of thousands of subscribers around the country, around the world.
I'm one of
a
them.
powerful force for
Me too.
communicating on these issues. And so there's new opportunities as well in this new environment. And I think it's really important to, highlight those as well.
Katharine, what about this question of whether the media somehow needs help, that maybe we're not up to the task anymore, we just don't have the clout, and both the advantages and possible dangers of the government getting more aggressive about calling out misinformation and even making calls about what information is science-based and what information isn't. Those are all value judgments. It can be very problematic. We can generally agree, that there's a powerful human footprint in the climate. The consensus is clear on that. But around the edges, there's all kinds of good faith disagreement. So how do we deal with that?
Well, I think there's things that we are as certain as a human can possibly be certain about. And then there are things that are still experimental or being explored. So for example, we have known for over 100 years that climate is changing and humans are responsible, and that we are heading into uncharted territory if we don't do something about it. So you can argue over whether the ice sheets are melting 6 times faster, 8 times faster, or 12 times faster than they were back in the 1990s. But what we know is that humans are responsible. So I think that when we make decisions as an individual, as an organization, as a business, or as a country, when we make decisions where we deliberately exclude factual information from those decisions, we are hurting all of us. And so that is why efforts like the National Climate Assessment are more thoroughly peer-reviewed than any other scientific document you will see, except for the IPCC. And of course, that's what's used as input to the Paris Agreement and international agreements. The National Climate Assessment is the most peer-reviewed document on climate science that we have, precisely because it is an official federal document laying out the state of the science and the impacts. So the federal government has an enormous role in providing definitive information that people can have confidence in and make decisions based on that information. Now, of course, the media, now with social media and the internet, we have access to everything. And as Ron said, it's a tool that can be used for good or for evil. So I do my best to try to use social media for good. And I'm on Twitter, for example, where every day, just about, I mean, not to exaggerate, maybe it's just 5 days a week, but 5 days a week, I have somebody tell me, don't you know it's been warmer before? And every time I sort of feel like, really? That's a shocker. It's only us climate scientists that actually study past climate, so that's how you know. But so there's this democratization of information where they think my Google search trumps 25 years in a scientific career, and that's the bad part. But the good part is that we can immediately reach and connect with and interact with. It's not one way, it's interacting with people all over the world, increasing our knowledge base, our experience, our perspective, and really making those connections that we need to address and understand these huge global issues. So there really is a benefit to that free exchange of information, but there is also a benefit to having the resources of a federal government provide definitive resources like, for example, the National Climate Assessment, the statements that an official from the National Institute of Health would make, or Dr. Fauci, or people like that making statements absolutely does make a difference, because there's an added level of weight to those that there isn't if it's just an individual speaking as themselves.
So do we need a Dr. Fauci of climate?
Well, I think we've had them. I mean, John Holdren certainly filled that role in the last administration, in my opinion. But I think that people will not care to listen to a Dr. Fauci of climate until they perceive the threat to be staring them in the eyeballs. So I don't think we're at that point yet, but I wish we were, because it is staring us in the eyeballs. Most of us can't see it yet.
I'd like to steer the conversation for a moment back to something that Ron just raised with the wonderful phrase about the democratization of information, of science. And certainly it is the case that scientific authority has been seriously undermined in recent years for a variety of reasons. Some of them economic, some of them political, some of them issue driven. But it's very interesting. Right now, we're in the middle of a remarkable public experiment in unfiltered scientific information. I mean, the preprint servers are spewing a fire hose of well-intentioned but unverified scientific data into the face of a willing public. You know, these are preliminary and often incorrect scientific findings. Catherine, you were talking about a world that's actually not with us anymore, this stately procession of peer review, and you don't have to find it on Google until it's actually been published somewhere. I mean, that just ain't the case anymore. I wonder, you know, how is that going to sort of affect us going forward? I mean, you know, not next week when we're arguing about the vaccine or whether or not we should sign back up to this codicil to a climate treaty or that codicil. But I mean, in the world to come, where all of us are participating in the open peer review of the medRxiv and Physics Archive and bioRxiv, and nobody can wait. What is that, and how do we handle it, and what will it do?
Yeah, Lee, I think that's such a great question, because I think we've seen that over the past decade or so, kind of in the area of diet and health. You know, we wake up every day, there's a new study, eat chocolate, it's good for you. Eat chocolate, don't eat chocolate, it's bad for you. Drink coffee, it's good for you. Don't drink coffee, it's bad for you. And I think it leads then to this sentiment in the public at large that all the studies kind of mean nothing, that, you know, I should just go online and Google up some stuff and it's what I believe, and so on and so forth. And I say that because that's really a backdrop for what we've seen really coming out in the anti-vaccine movement in public health. It's people, yes, there are some people who are just whatever, fringe people, but I think in some ways the scarier part of it is well-intentioned people say, I went online, I read a bunch of stuff, and like I've made up my own schedule for how my child should be vaccinated. And I kind of think from based on the things that I've read that like we should spread these shots out differently and we should do this differently and so on and so forth, right? The well-intentioned misinformed, the well-intentioned uninformed, right? And I think that this kind of, as you said, this fire hose of information that's coming at people really makes people struggle to process it, and kind of at some point it lets people kind of either carve their own path separate from expertise, or just throw up their hands and say there is no expertise, it's just a bunch of opinions, it just all conflicts, so on and so forth. And I think that's a real challenge for science and science communicators to try to say that, no, I understand you're reading all this stuff and saying this, but there actually are some answers here. Last thing I want to add to it is, this goes back to something Catherine said a minute ago. The other struggle here is there are some things for which we have answers and some things for which we don't. And I think the other challenge for science communicators is how to deal with that difference. We saw this a lot during Ebola, where, you know, in uncertainty. So one of my favorite instances in the Ebola response dealt with Dr. Craig Spencer, the doctor who fought Ebola in West Africa, came back to the US and was diagnosed with Ebola, living in New York City. And the day before he was diagnosed, he had ridden the subway in New York. And the biggest question became, could you get Ebola on the subway? And I remember Dr. Tom Frieden, who was the head of the CDC, went on television that night and said, you know, they said, well, can you get Ebola on the subway in New York? And he's like, well, look, you know, it's exceedingly improbable. You know, you'd have to be bleeding while I was on the subway, and someone would have to touch the blood, blah, 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 and painted this incredibly, really remote prospect. And the journalist turned back to him and said, so you're saying you can get Ebola on the subway in New York. You're saying you can't rule it out, right? And so I think when we deal with these uncertainties also, not the proven facts, but the unproven facts, the unknowns, the new facts, we face a challenge in trying to give people a sense of what we know and what we don't know, what we believe, all these things. That's what science is, right? And I think trying to communicate about that effectively is a real challenge in this world where there's just so much information and so much of an ability for people to kind of either throw up their hands or pretend like they can sort it out themselves.
Yeah, so Catherine, that's really what I'm sitting here thinking. Should I just like throw up my hands and go home? I mean, how do I filter out all this unverified information for a public that's not interested in listening to it in the first place because I no longer have any authority?
Well, I think the phrase that Ron was referring to is cognitive misers. So in other words, our brains are no longer big enough to process all the information we need to make up our minds about everything, about climate change, vaccinations, the pandemic, immigration, the budget. I mean, we just can't process that information. So what we do is we go to trusted sources. And on some issues, most trusted sources are saying sort of the same thing. But unfortunately, on a lot of issues, everything from vaccines to GMOs to climate change to even potentially the pandemic response, sources that we trust are saying very different things. And so that is, getting back to your previous question, I do see that as the role of bodies who are able to support assessment. We haven't really talked about this concept yet, but we scientists do individual studies. So one scientist does the coffee's good, the other does the coffee's bad, the other says no, coffee really is good, the other says no, it's actually bad. But what an assessment is when, for example, you know, a board of physicians, the American Association of Physicians gets together, or the American Geophysical Union, or the American Association for the Advancement of Science, or the National Climate Assessment, or the US Global Change Research Program, or some branch of the government, gets together as an authoritative body, and the National Academy of Sciences, Medicine, and Engineering, this is exactly what they do. They get together as a body, they convene the relevant experts, they have a thorough discussion, they issue an authoritative statement or document, and there is a really important role for that increasingly in this world, because otherwise, how can you tell what is the truth?
But Katharine, you see the problem is speed, right? So when NAS, when a panel does a significant investigation, produces a report, that could be 2 years plus.
I know, I agree.
We're moving at a lie travels around the globe in 5 minutes. I don't remember what the cliche is, but we have to update that process somehow, and it's not at all clear to me how we do that.
Well, you're speaking my language, because I have been advocating for the National Climate Assessment to move to the year 2020 for quite a while now. We don't read books anymore. Everything is online. So having rolling documents online that are regularly updated and current, I think, is what we need to be doing. Instead of having 2 years when we have an emergency situation, convene a panel. The panel discussion, with pulling in all relevant experts who are familiar with their own area of expertise, you could shorten the timeline massively. If we recognize that we live in the 2020s now, we don't live in the 1920s anymore. Unfortunately, science is very conservative and very hidebound in terms of still doing things the way that we used to 100 years ago.
Kind of reminds me of trying to rush a vaccine. There are obviously costs and benefits when you do that. Even then, though, Katharine, I mean, what you're describing sounds great, but it doesn't really sound like it's a realistic response to, somebody on cable news saying something outrageous, and that we need like a lightning team or something.
Oh, we have that. It exists. It's called climate feedback, and it is a volunteer effort from climate scientists to peer review news articles and media reports. So they can't do everything because it's volunteer. If anybody's listening and wants to support them, please do. But climate feedback is fantastic because they actually take like a news report and they actually fact check it. So,
Dan, along that line, I mean, we have a question here I wonder might be appropriate from one of our audience, Nan Wu, who asks about the role of scientists in government and their impact on the society. I mean, how is it in other countries? We tend to, of course, just talk about things through the lens of the US, but are there any lessons there we can learn from other frameworks? Ron.
Oh, look, I think that there are lessons we can learn. I mean, I was struck the other day by listening to Angela Merkel discuss the COVID epidemic in her country and explain the R0 rate and explain the different things they're doing to control. And, would that we had a scientist president in America, things would be very, very different here, I think. Germany is one of the countries that's most successfully managed this epidemic of all the countries in Europe. And I think it's because of her leadership in no small part. And I think her science background is part of that. I think we have other countries where you have, here in America, Tony Fauci has become a very famous figure here over the course of this. He was a famous figure for a long time in any event. But I think what really stands out about Dr. Fauci is that he's a scientist who served in our government for 6 administrations, served under President Reagan and President Bush and President Clinton and President Bush, President Obama, and now President Trump. That's common in other countries. That's rare in our country. We tend to politicize high-level science positions in our country, or at least partisanize them in the sense that people come and go, as administrations come and go. And I think one reason why Dr. Fauci has so much credibility in this situation right now is people can say, well, Ronald Reagan listened to him or Barack Obama listened to him, and whether or not I believe in Ronald Reagan or Barack Obama, both of them believed in Tony Fauci, so that's a really good thing. Whereas the White House science advisor changes every 4 years, all these other senior positions change. So I think trying to find ways to have more of a permanent expertise in our government that extends from administration to administration, I think would be a good thing. I think, again, that's the way most European democracies work, and it would certainly be helpful here. And I think Dr. Fauci, as I said, is kind of an example of the very best of that, which we're seeing firsthand in the middle of this crisis.
So, Ron, can I follow up on something that you said before? You know, you talked about the epidemic racing through Africa, which most people seem to believe that it will, even though it hasn't quite yet, at least in terms of Central Africa. A questioner, Johnny Mowens, points out, you know, or asks, to what extent do you think lockdowns are applicable to poorer conflict-ridden nations such as Africa and the Middle East? And I guess the follow-up to that, really, for both of you all, is clearly we need global institutions to lead us out of a transnational problem. Transnational problems like climate change and a pandemic. But it's also pretty clear that, you know, not only are solutions that have been attempted in Europe not necessarily applicable elsewhere. Same thing with South Korea, et cetera. We have these cultural barriers. We also just seem to be going in totally the opposite direction. We're not thinking internationally. We're increasingly sorting ourselves into these smaller groups built around language or race or culture. And so that means that institutions like WHO or the IPCC, they're not really succeeding when we have to be blunt about this. And it's not for lack of data or policy ideas or even strategy, but it's simply because they don't have the budget or the power to actually implement their ideas. So I guess the question is, what do we do in that kind of a situation where we have this immediate threat of a pandemic and we don't have solutions in the developing world, and with this longer range threat of climate change? And in neither case do we have sort of a truly able international institutions that are capable of sort of quarterbacking this thing. What do we do? Do we need just some kind of whole new system, or do we just need to sort of re-up and reinvest in groups like the WHO and the IPCC? Ron, you can go first.
I'll start with the health side of it. Let Katharine talk about the IPCC and other things. I mean, there's a lot in that question, Dan, but let me try to hit a part of it this way. WHO is a very limited purpose organization. It exists to enforce the international health regulations. It does not respond to epidemics. If we have tens or hundreds of thousands or millions of cases of COVID in Africa, it is not going to be the WHO that treats those people. It's not going to be the WHO that rushes doctors and nurses to the scene. As a planet, we rely on NGOs to do that work. And I think that sounds incredible if you stop and think about it. Here we have this threat that could wipe out millions and millions of people. And our answer is a bunch of volunteers. Now, they are, I don't mean to demean them at all. These are the most amazing, incredible organizations in the world. I love them, I worship them, I respect them. You know, these organizations like Partners in Health here in the United States and MSF and all these groups, these are amazing things. But that is the world response system right now to epidemics. It's a bunch of NGOs. The WHO has never been empowered to do that. It's never gonna be empowered to do that, right? So I think the question is, should we as a world build response mechanisms to deal with that. Now, some time ago, the German government came up with this idea of a kind of a white helmet battalion of responders. There'd be an international healthcare response group that would be able to deal with security issues when disease destabilizes an area, as well as to race medical help there. I think that's an idea that I've personally endorsed, embraced. There are a lot of other ideas about this. But I think what's really going to become obvious to the planet right now is that the way we're fighting COVID is each country's kind of fighting it on its own. The WHO kind of raises alerts, sends out alarms, but doesn't really treat patients. And that's working greater to lesser extent in well-developed countries now, but that is really going to be exposed for the gap it is when this disease moves to developing countries with very weak national healthcare systems that aren't capable of fighting on its own. And when they ring the alarm bell in those countries, there's no global institution that's going to come and answer that alarm. We're going to have to rely on these NGOs to do that.
And before we move on to Katharine, are we just stuck with that system? Is there a practical alternative? What would a better system look like?
Well, again, I think a better system would be some kind of international response organization, perhaps led by the EU, perhaps led by some other organization. I will say the UN was a spectacular failure at this in Ebola. They sent a relief mission to West Africa that was completely ineffective. So I think you need some kind of organization, some kind of response group that has international reach. You know, in Ebola, we solved this problem. We kind of cheated this problem, if you will, by using the US military in the first ever deployment of US troops to fight an epidemic, Operation United Assistance. We sent troops to Liberia. The British sent troops to Sierra Leone. The French sent troops to Guinea. And that was a solution in that extreme case. But it was a very bespoke solution because there are a lot of places in the world where to fight a disease, you cannot send US troops unless you're going to send them to shoot people. I mean, like the US troops are not, in Liberia, our troops were welcomed as, you know, with a great relationship between our two countries. They're grateful to have our troops on the ground. That's not true in most parts of the world. And so you need some kind of internationalized security and response force to do the things you need to do. Look, right now we have the second worst Ebola epidemic in the history of the world going on in Congo. Thousands and thousands of people have died. That's taking place even though now we have an effective vaccine for Ebola. So why is that going on with an effective vaccine? Because it's in a destabilized area with a lot of local violence, and the people who want to give the vaccinations keep getting shot. So you need to send those healthcare workers in there with some kind of security force that allows them to operate in a secure environment so they can fight the disease. As crazy as it is that we're completely reliant on NGOs to stop epidemics, it's crazier to expect that they're going to be able to work in a place that's security compromised and do so in any kind of effective way. But that's where we are right now.
So Katharine, you are very invested in the IPCC process. You've been the primary author in I don't know how many rounds, but multiple rounds. And, you know, I know we're not here to trash the IPCC. It does really strong science. But if the goal of the IPCC is, and the COP processes, is somehow to come up with a practical plan an implementable plan to reduce emissions, that process is a failure. I think, Katharine, you have to acknowledge. Do you?
Well, just to be clear, I've been a lead author on the U.S. National Climate Assessment for several rounds, and I made that decision deliberately to focus on that rather than on the IPCC because they have two very different goals. So the goal of the National Climate Assessment is to inform adaptation, resilience, and mitigation in the U.S., whereas the goal of the IPCC, let's be 100% clear, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change is a group of scientists, and their goal is simply this. It is to provide the science that underlies the international negotiations. So it's not up to the IPCC to say, here's how you fix this problem. Their whole mandate is to provide the science that the negotiators need at the Conference of Parties. And the negotiators are not scientists, they're politicians and policy experts. So the IPCC provides the science to them, and they are the ones who negotiate the Paris Agreement, the Kyoto Protocol, and try to figure out how the heck do you enforce something that's like a potluck dinner where half the people don't want to bring what they're assigned to. So it isn't really the mandate of the IPCC to do this. It is the Conference of Parties, which is a political entity. And the challenge is, how do you enforce an international treaty? You can enforce it through shaming. You can enforce it through border tariffs. You can enforce it through other kind of more aggressive actions, but it's really much more in Ron's ballpark than mine. How do you enforce an international treaty? The fact that it's about climate change is frankly at this point incidental to how do you enforce something when it's the first time everybody in the world has to pitch in to make sure that we all have a solution for all of us.
So in your view, our problems are not really related to the inability of scientists to come together or find consensus or even express that clearly, set clear goals. It's simply politics, that the root of all international conflict for the last, 2,000 years. I mean,
let me give you a specific example. It's even worse than you think. Because for the summary for policymakers of the IPCC, the countries that are signatories to the Conference of Parties have to agree to the science, even though they're not scientists. So the major conflicts over the information and the statements in the IPCC has been not from scientists, but from countries. And I just finished writing an obituary from one of our leaders. Sir John Houghton was one of the key founders of the IPCC. He served as chair or co-chair for the first 3 volumes. He passed away 2 weeks ago from COVID-19. And he, like me, was motivated to care about climate change because it disproportionately affects the poorest and most vulnerable people in the world. But he was one of those people who's, gentle as a dove, but wise as a serpent. And in the 3rd assessment report, there was a statement that several of the major oil producing countries, that was a Freudian slip. Several of the oil producing countries did not want to agree to. So he said, okay, well, we'll put in as a compromise, we'll have a footnote saying that not everybody agreed to this. So they said, okay, that's fine. So he put in the footnote and he named the countries. As soon as they saw their name was there, their objections disappeared and the statement stood. But even communicating the science is fraught with politics.
Well, there are different ways of saying the word politics. Politics, of course, sounds dismissive. And if you called it a visceral sense of threat and danger, then, it's got a different emotional and valence. And I want to just change the valence a tiny bit. The IPCC, the kind of public health response, Ron, that you're talking about, and Catherine, these are very laudable international politically cooperative ventures. And one thing that we're seeing in response to this visceral threat of the COVID-19 illness is that, we're seeing a resurgence of the most kind of primitive nationalism. I mean, border walls are going up and travel is banned and us and them is being like reestablished in ways that I've just simply not seen in my lifetime. But it has also exposed a kind of international economic interchange on which many of these systems, whether they're medical or otherwise, depend. I mean, these supply chains that stretch from country to country and country with was it last in, first out supply policies and such for critical medical materials, but also for food. Who can get a pork chop right now because everybody's worried about the fate of, understandably and laudably worried about the fate of workers in a pork plant 1,000 or 1,500 miles away from your dinner table. So what I wonder, and what I'd like you to think about here, in this new world that we're talking about down the road, I mean, will localism, political, but also agriculture, manufacturing, these sort of critical supply sources that we're seeing being ripped apart right now by a pandemic. Will these things start to reassert themselves? I mean, how will that affect our ability to meet these huge challenges like pandemics and climate change that we spent most of the past hour discussing? Localism, nationalism? Ron, what do you say?
Well, I think it's some of both. Look, I think that some of this is common sense. I mean, obviously, restricting travel to try to help prevent the spread of a disease is a common sense measure. And we're restricting it internally in our country. We're restricting it internationally. We obviously don't want people moving around, period, end of story. And so I think some of these things we have to be careful not to condemn the wrong way. Some of these things are just common sense measures. But I do think that your point about this struggle about international connectedness is really being laid bare by this COVID epidemic, both the good and the bad. So look, on the one hand, what is becoming clear is how interdependent as a planet we are. We have this big problem in our country that we aren't really testing enough people with the disease. Why is that? There are a lot of reasons why that is, but one reason why that is that the supply chain for key parts of the way we test people comes from overseas. Mm-hmm. Key things are made overseas. Chemicals are made overseas. Reagents that are used to test people for the disease. Parts in the little machines that read the tests are made overseas. And so this is a very interdependent planet. And that's a lesson we're learning, okay? And I think two things will come out of that. One, I think there'll be more appreciation for that interconnectedness on the one hand. And on the other hand, there will be some understandable sentiment to say like, hey, we should source this stuff in our own country. We should be less dependent on global trade. I don't think that's unreasonable to have both those concerns. Now, here's where the rubber's going to meet the road. That's when this vaccine is finally developed. And I think as Americans, we often assume that we're going to make it here in America, we're going to find the vaccine here in America, our vaccine, our docs, our scientists, our factories, our needles, our things. That's the American way. The reality is that may be true, but it may not be true. It may well be discovered in Europe or China or someplace else on the planet. And then the question is going to be who's going to get the vaccine. And all of a sudden, nationalism is going to seem less appealing if this vaccine is discovered in Europe and Americans don't want to wait in line to be the very last ones to get it. And so
Catherine,
to get a really powerful lesson in what an interconnected planet this is and how important those relationships are as we go forward in this.
So Catherine, from your standpoint, how does that interconnected planet hold up as we move forward?
Absolutely. I mean, that applies to almost everything that we see today. When we think back to the mortgage crisis, the collapse of banks in Iceland affected the economy in the United States. When we think about air pollution, we have no national boundaries that keep air pollution out. When we think about climate change, it does not matter where you produce that carbon. You could emit it at the North or the South Pole and it would still affect all of us. So we all share this planet. And what we have in common is more than what divides us. Not just our DNA, but the fact that when it all comes down to it, we really do want clean air to breathe, clean water to drink, enough food to eat, a safe place to live, a healthy economy that gives us a job. We really do all want the same things. And this is exactly what climate change threatens. So within this interconnected world, how do we work together? This requires collective action, the likes of which we've never seen before. Climate change is the ultimate tragedy of the commons. Dating back from the concept where, a village used to share a common grazing area. And if everybody grazed just one animal, there would be enough for everyone. But if one person said, oh, I will take advantage of this shared area to graze as many animals as I can, pretty soon there would be no grass left for anyone. So it requires international cooperation to fix this thing. But the one thing we haven't mentioned yet, though we've alluded to this multiple times, is the fact that these crises, like the coronavirus pandemic and very much like climate change, are a threat multiplier. In other words, they take issues of poverty, lack of access to resources, political instability, other pre-existing crises or flaws in our system or weaknesses or vulnerabilities. It takes these and it exacerbates or amplifies them. 9 times out of 10, for example, climate change is not creating a new problem we've never seen before. It's taking something that we already have and it is making it much worse. So that's really, in a nutshell, why it matters. The pandemic disproportionately affects people who already have damage to their lungs, people who live in polluted areas, people who don't have access to good health care. In Chicago, I think the statistics I saw were 30% of the population is African American and 60% of the deaths from COVID-19 are African American. There is an intimate connection between race, between socioeconomic status, between even gender, women and children being disproportionately impacted by the impacts of a changing climate. between all of the issues that already fracture our society and climate change is fitting into those fissures and fractures and driving us even further apart. And that's why to fix climate change, we're going to be fixing a lot of other problems as we go along at the same time. But if we don't fix climate change first, we're not going to have the time to fix anything else.
So we've had a number of questions about China that are coming in over the transom here, and it's hard to summarize them, but there's definitely a lot of skepticism, we know this, that it will even be possible to have a meeting of the minds between the US and China, between, nations that consider themselves democratic and those that are not. And there's just sort of a feeling that one of the reasons that we're moving toward increasing nationalism is this feeling of fundamental competitiveness. And so I guess my question for both of you is, how can we possibly reach an accommodation with governments whose systems are so fundamentally different than our own? And how do we do that? I mean, Katharine, if you focus more on the national assessment than international, but in your dealings with scientists from China and other places that are not functioning democracies, is science somehow going to get us past those differences, or how do we deal with that?
Well, scientists are scientists no matter where we're from, and we're able to connect very well across the world, but the extent to which our information is used to make decisions in our different countries varies radically around the world. What I will say though, and I want Ron to comment more on this because this is really his ballpark, but people often say, the biggest question I get on climate change often is, so what about China? The implication being that the United States is doing all these wonderful things to reduce carbon emissions, yet China is building a new coal-fired power plant today. Mm-hmm. Well, that used to be the case a decade ago, but now they're shutting down coal-fired plants. They're selling their coal to poorer countries. China has more wind and solar energy than any other country in the world, and they've been enabled to enforce sustainable development because of their government structure. So now when people say, what about China? I say, yeah, what about China? Do you want them to be beating the pants off the United States, technologically speaking, in the new clean energy economy, which powers our entire society? So people often assume that other types of governments can't move ahead as fast as democratic governments. But in fact, I think there's actually a very real danger of other more autocratic governments actually moving ahead more quickly than democratic society. And that, I think, brings it strictly into Ron's ballpark to comment on.
Yeah, look, I think that a couple of points here about China and COVID. First of all, I do think that one of the strengths of democratic societies in this battle with autocratic societies, or struggle with autocratic societies, is openness and transparency. And the Chinese were not open. They were not transparent about the coronavirus. And that hurt people in China, that hurt people around the world. And so I think that both systems have their strengths and weaknesses. I obviously strongly prefer the democratic system, and I think we're seeing one of those strengths right now, which is, though I have a lot of disagreements with how the Trump administration is handling coronavirus, I'm free to debate those disagreements on television at night, and Governor Cuomo's free to offer his view, and Governor DeWine's free to offer his view, and hopefully we get to the right answer that way. I think openness and transparency is really important. The lack of that's really hurting China on this case. I think also, when we talk about an interconnected world, that isn't just something for us to kind of lecture Americans about that. We're seeing the consequence of interconnectedness here with this coronavirus epidemic. I'm sorry, the practice of there being wet markets in China needs to end. It needs to end because it's bad for our environment, it's bad for healthcare, it's bad for wildlife, and whether or not coronavirus specifically came from a wet market or some other source in China, we know that SARS definitely came from one of those markets, and we're going to increasingly see these epidemics emerge from that. And so this is an interconnected world. People do travel all over the world. We can try to regulate that. We can try to stop that in times of crisis. But what we've seen in this crisis and in ones before it is that practices everywhere affect practices everywhere. Life comes everywhere. And so again, I think it's nothing wrong with Americans standing up and saying, hey, China, we need to see an end to the way in which you have this trade in wildlife that's getting people sick in your country. It's getting people sick in our country too, and around the world, right? So I think that's an important point. Look, obviously, our relationship with China is one of the most important bilateral relationships in the world. It's going to be a challenge for this administration. It's going to be a challenge for the next administration. But I think there's nothing wrong, and I think there's everything right about saying that the Chinese need to be more transparent and accountable for what happened here, and they need to worry about their practices that are really affecting us. And this trade in wildlife is one of those practices.
Are you confident that if we cut a deal with China and China agreed to shut down those markets, that those markets actually would shut down? I mean, the little experience I've had in China and everything that I've read makes me think that you know, for an autocracy, they're not as successfully controlling, you know, at the local level as we might think. And it seems to me that in China and Africa, you know, throughout the world, that, you know, we can cut high-minded deals, but then what actually happens on the ground, especially in poor communities, is something very different.
Look, I agree, Dan. Nothing's going to be perfect, but I think if we don't even try, we know it's not getting shut down. And I think, you know, again, this is one of those things where we need to really make a big effort to make a push on this, among other things. I mean, it's not the only thing, but among other things, this is something where something that would be better for our environment and for all kinds of other natural resources would also be better for our health. And look, I do think we've seen this emergence of more and more zoonotic diseases in the past 15 years. There are a lot of factors. It's not just that we're better informed, that we've seen the succession of SARS and MERS, Ebola, Zika, now COVID. This isn't just like, oh, these things used to happen, we didn't know about them. There is more of this happening now, and that's a factor of global connectedness, climate change to some extent already, and that will be an increasing factor in this, and all these other environmental issues and global health issues. And we need to get together on this and address these issues on all fronts.
Are you all optimists? You know, I think of you both Katharine and Ron, you know, from when I've listened to you and read your work, you're constantly sort of looking on the bright side. And of course, that's a really hard thing to do in a world of pandemics and ever rising emissions curves. The thing about these trend lines is that one of the things they suggest is that our past optimism might actually have been part of the problem, that we've been naive in our failure to anticipate our failures, our failure to anticipate, you know, the rise of nationalism, the spread of public distrust. We haven't really been ahead on any of these things. They've caught us by surprise. Maybe one of the problems is that we're too optimistic. Maybe we need to be, you know, pessimistic. So I guess my question is, are you still optimistic? And if so, what are you optimistic about? Ron, why don't you go ahead? You've got the floor.
Yeah, look, I guess I am always an optimist. I think that's a frame of mind that helps me get through the day and get through the years. You know, you know, in this conversation about science and journalists, I'm neither a scientist nor I'm a journalist. I'm a lawyer and a former public official and someone who believes profoundly that political action can make the country and the world a better place. And I think to have that belief, you kind of have to be an optimist about the ability of people to change, and people to change their country, and people to change this world. And there are obviously, if you look at the history of our country, good moments and bad moments and forward-leaning moments and backward-working moments. But, you know, I do think that the arc of the universe bends inevitably towards justice. And I do think that when people are willing to get active in politics, by and large, good things come out of that. And, you know, that's what I've devoted my life to, and you're not going to talk me out of that at this stage in the game. And, you know, and I think obviously we're, you know, at a key moment for a lot of these choices right now as a country and as a planet. And I really hope I wouldn't be spending my time this evening talking to your audience if I didn't believe that if we get people activated and mobilized and engaged, we couldn't make a better country and a better world out of that.
Do you see COVID particularly as a force? Do you see any of that in the response to COVID?
I think you see some of that in response to COVID. Look, I mean, how can you not be impressed by the people who are putting their lives on the line to save other people every day? Obviously, our healthcare workers and our doctors, nurses, our first responders, of course, but people who are delivering packages to my house so I can stay home and keep myself safe, the people who are creating the electricity that lets us to have this conversation and the internet that lets us have this conversation. A lot of people out there every day doing things to make life possible for the rest of us. And that's enormously impressive. The people like Chef Jose Andres and the team at World Central Kitchen that's out there feeding people all over this country and all over this world. There are just so many causes, so many acts of kindness and impressive organization and leadership that really make you believe that we can do better, we can get through this, and we can emerge on the other side in some ways stronger and better than we went into this. And that is my optimism. That is my source of hope. Katharine,
you're a very optimistic person. It's part of your power, I think. You're a bright side person while also being very realistic in your sense of the data. Based on what you've seen in COVID and based on what you know of the state of the climate movement, what specific reasons do you have to be optimistic these days?
So what's very interesting is when I talk with people here in the US, in Canada, and the UK, around the world, I collect questions using a poll everywhere software. And for the last 3 or 4 years, the number one question that I've got almost everywhere I've spoken to any group you can imagine is, what gives you hope? So I've turned that around and I asked about 500 people so far in about 7 different places, what gives you hope? Because I would say, well, first of all, it's not the science, because every new study that comes out seems like it's changing faster to a greater extent than we thought. If anything, we climate scientists err on the side of underestimating the rate of change and how it's affecting us rather than overestimating it. And with all due respect to Ron, I think probably the only thing we disagree on, Ron, is I don't get my hope from politics either. My approach is I expect the worst from politics, and then if it doesn't happen, I'm pleasantly surprised. But I'm always looking for those moments, though, so please do keep up the good work. But I asked people, what gives you hope? And what was absolutely fascinating to me is that although I got a very broad range of answers, they all focused around one thing: people. People are what give us hope. Whether it's looking at the amazing kids who are raising their voices in the kids' climate strike, whether it's looking at unexpected leaders in the faith community, conservative politics, the military, or elsewhere, whether it's hearing about tremendous advances in the fact that, over 70% of new electricity being installed around the world is solar, or, Bill Gates is investing in high energy solar to decarbonize some of the most intensive aspects of our industry, or a big corporation like Walmart plans to be 50% clean energy in 5 years. Hearing about what people are doing, seeing what people are doing, recognizing that this issue is not a giant boulder sitting at the bottom of a hill with only a few hands on it. The boulder is actually already slowly rolling down the hill. And it's got millions of hands on it. It just has to go faster. That is what gives us hope. But hope is not going to come find us. So I look for hope actively. I look for it online. I've got Google News trained to give me good news stories. There's certain websites I go to look for good news stories. I collect good news stories from other people and I try to share them on social media all the time. We are constantly inundated with bad news. In fact, the other day when I was giving a talk on hope, I went to CNN's website. And I just did a little experiment that one day, just before my talk, I looked at the headlines they had listed. There was 35 headlines. A few of them were neutral, like just factual, but over 30 out of the 35 were negative and not a single one was positive. So we are inundated with bad news all the time. And for that hope, we have to actively go out and look for it. And when we find it, we have to share it. And it's through hearing what other people are doing, through acting ourselves, that we find that hope.
And if I may say, we have just had evidence for the last hour and a half of this conversation. of reason for that hope, because, you know, terrible events always convey a lesson that we don't necessarily understand until it's long past. But it's very clear already that we have become aware in this epidemic of how many new opportunities and that we have to speak together, how much information is actually available, not just to authorities and experts like the four here and some in the audience, but to every single man and woman on the planet, and the ease with which we can exchange our ideas and reason together. I mean, that is a miracle moment, and that certainly is reason for hope. And I really want to thank you, Katharine. I want to thank you, Ron. And Dan, I'd like to actually thank you for having had the idea for this and conceived it and orchestrated it. It is a fact that our time is now run out, and I suppose I should do the old-fashioned thing, the pre-epidemic thing, and say thank you all very, very much. And please be well, be healthy, have a very good evening.
Thank you very much.